So now I want to introduce the idea of one-point perspective, and this is going to be something that we'll talk about later in more detail in the class, but I think it's nice to have kind of a preliminary understanding of it. So one-point perspective is sort of a method of communicating visually that space recedes on a two-dimensional surface the way it would appear to recede for us in a three-dimensional space. So there's a couple critical things about one-point perspective. I'm going to point out now, you don't need to remember them, we'll talk about them later, but just to explain that this line here is the horizon line. And so I've drawn all of the lines radiating out. Below here is green, just to kind of help imagine that this might be maybe a grassy field, and all the lines radiating out above the horizon line is blue, so you can kind of pretend that's blue sky. This dot here in the center is the vanishing point, and that's the point where things get far enough away that they disappear or that lines converge. So if we can, let's kind of use your mind here and let's project some things on this illustration of one-point perspective. So these lines here could be maybe they're the edges of a highway. Maybe we're standing in a highway, not very safe to do, but as it gets further away, it kind of moves up on the picture plane and gets smaller. Maybe these are railroad tracks, and the same thing happens, that as it gets further back in space, it recedes into the distance. This could be, again, a grassy soccer field, and these lines here are the soccer field lines. Of course, not everything recedes all the way back out into the distance. So if we're going to draw maybe the soccer field here, it might end about here, and it might come out, this might be the edge. So it would be all of this green space in here would be the soccer field. Now, why is this helpful? Well, this is helpful it kind of gives us a framework in which to anchor our objects. So let's take our cylinder here, and we'll set our cylinder. So, okay, this was a soccer field, now it's going to be a tabletop, this shape here. Let's set our cylinder on the tabletop, and you can see that here's the size of the cylinder. Now what happens if we move the cylinder back in space? Now I'm going to keep my arm steady so that I'm not moving the cylinder up or down, but what happens, where does it move on the picture plane? It's no longer anchored to that bottom line. It's moving, it's not only getting smaller, but it actually appears to be moving up in space. And so if we were to draw those cylinders, let me put this up as an example. Okay, let's draw a cylinder. Let's draw a cylinder here, sitting on the table. Actually, I'll move it over here just for the sake of space. So, okay, there's our cylinder. Let's do a quick drawing. This won't be perfect, but there's our cylinder. Right? Now we'll move the cylinder back in space. And now it's up here. So still sitting on the surface of the table. It's just gotten smaller and kind of moved up a little bit on the picture plane. And now that's below the horizon line, and the opposite is going to be true as we move above the horizon line. So above the horizon line, it's gonna go the opposite way. So we can illustrate that with some handy dandy cubes. So I'm just going to take a minute to erase these a little bit, just so you can see through the glass a little bit more. So now let's try playing with some cubes going receding into three-dimensional space. So I'm going to draw some squares here. Just going to kind of randomly draw some squares. So let's say, that's a little crooked, that's okay. Okay, so we have 3 squares. Now I want to turn these squares into 3-dimensional cubes that recede into space. And the way I can do that is using 1-point perspective here. I can kind of draw an imaginary line with my eyes between these points and then fill them in. Okay, so now it appears that that cube is sitting on this surface plane and receding into the distance. Let's do the same thing with this one. First of all, I'm going to kind of draw these imaginary lines with my eyes. Then I can fill them in. And of course you can use a ruler. We'll be using a ruler later. Right now we're not shooting for perfection. We just want to help illustrate the point. Okay, so now these cubes recede. The cube gets smaller, it moves up in the picture plane as it recedes into the distance. This cube up here, which, let's say if this is a horizon line, it's floating in the sky, this is going to be different. Rather than kind of moving up in space, the opposite's going to be true, because those perspective lines are going to go towards the vanishing point. And rather than seeing the top surface of the cubes here, we're actually going to see the underneath surface of the cube, or in this case, that looks a little more like a rectangle or a elongated form. Okay, neat. So it's okay if this is still a little bit confusing. I just want to introduce the idea because we'll be talking about it in more detail later on in the class.